So we're going to be having two speakers today, both from Chicago Hopes for Kids. The first is Erica Walker. Erica is a licensed social worker and has worked with children and families for nearly 20 years, including therapeutic and alternative education settings. She has a master's degree in clinical social work from the Crown School of Social Work Policy and Practice at the University of Chicago, and an undergraduate degree in African American Studies from Harvard University. She's been the program manager at Hopes since 2018 and recently celebrated her third anniversary here. And the next speaker we will have will be Alex Galván. Alex is the Outreach and Family Engagement Administrator at Chicago Hopes for Kids and is currently in her first year graduate student at the University of Chicago's School of Social Work, Policy, and Practice. And so I'll pass it on to Erica to begin the presentation.
Hi, everybody. So the first thing we're going to do is start out with some definitions. All right, what exactly is trauma? According to the Center for Treatment of Anxiety and Mood Disorders, trauma is defined as a psychological, emotional response to an event or an experience that is deeply distressing or disturbing. So we can unpack this a little bit. Psychological emotional response means that it's an internal response, right? It involves perception and feeling, or an interpretation of a particular event. That interpretation of the event or an experience would be deeply distressing or disturbing. So the key word there is deeply. It would be something that would be considered or perceived as, greater than normal, or, greater than a person may feel they can handle. Another definition of trauma can be experiencing an event that overwhelms a person's ability to cope. All right. So it's a subjective experience. It's a subjective occurrence. It's a personal response. All right. Reactions to trauma can be immediate or delayed. In other words, a person can have a traumatic response to an event in the moment, or that response can emerge over time. All right. A traumatic response can also differ in severity, and it can manifest differently. Can manifest in different changes in behavior or different types of observable responses. It also is influenced by a person's culture. Some cultures encourage people to maybe withhold outward expression of strong emotion. And so that response to a traumatic event might not be as outwardly apparent. Other cultures maybe don't have those same restrictions. And so there'll be more of an outward display of a response to a traumatic event. Factors that can make people perhaps more sensitive to experiencing trauma can include being directly involved in the event, especially being a victim or directly experiencing that event, as opposed to maybe viewing it from the outside or viewing it from a distance. Having a severe or prolonged exposure to the event. So, for example, if it's a natural disaster, the days and weeks after, recovering from that disaster, the person is still immersed in the overwhelming and deeply traumatic experience. Having a personal history of prior trauma can come into play. So having experienced previous traumas makes a person more susceptible to responding to later incidents with a trauma response. Having a family or personal history of mental illness or severe behavioral problems can exacerbate this response. Having limited social support or lack of caring family and friends. So lacking a safety network, protective factors that can help mitigate a person's response. And having ongoing life stressors, such as moving to a new home or to a new school. So again, things that can happen not necessarily in one instance of time, but things that are ongoing can combine and exacerbate a person's ability to cope and can therefore put them at a greater risk of experiencing a deeply distressing or disturbing event as traumatic. Okay, next slide, please. We have a brief video to show you. We want to talk next about the way traumatic experiences can impact the brain itself. So in order to do that, I want to understand a little bit more about how the brain develops, a little bit more about the different parts of the brain, how these interact, how these work together, and what traumatic experiences do to disrupt that normal functioning. Okay? This video comes from a treatment center in Queensland, Australia.
The brain develops from the bottom up. The first thing to develop is the brainstem, or the reptilian brain as some people might call it. This area is responsible for our bodily functions. It tells us when to regulate our temperature, when to sleep, and when to eat. The next important part of our brains to develop is the limbic system, or what some people might call the mammalian part of the brain. The limbic system supports a variety of functions including emotion, behaviour, motivation, and long-term memory. The next part of the brain to develop is the cortex, which is the outer layer of the brain. This is sometimes considered the human part because humans are one of the only mammals that develop this part of the brain. This part of the brain is responsible for how we as humans were able to develop language, have thoughts, self-awareness, perception, and consciousness. Also, the cortex plays a key role in integrating the central nervous system and functions of memory. The last and most advanced part of the brain to develop is the prefrontal cortex, which is considered the executive functioning part of the brain. For some people, this part doesn't fully develop until they're in their mid to late 20s. The prefrontal cortex helps us to think through cause and effect, the ability to plan for the future, set goals, and understand the consequences of our actions. It's also responsible for the ability to moderate social behaviour. When we're in a stressful situation, part of our limbic system called the amygdala sets off an alarm bell response to let us know we're in danger and we need to do something about it. When this happens, the brain floods with a hormone called cortisol, so the body knows that something needs to be done. The most common responses to a stressful or dangerous situation are some you might be familiar with: fight, flight, freeze, or submit. This is an inbuilt system of survival to keep us safe when we're in danger. Like when our ancestors might have had to decide whether to stand their ground and fight against a large predator or run away. A stress response is a healthy, normal part of being a human. It lets us know that our bodies are working and keeping us safe. If a person is exposed to a highly stressful or traumatic event, or they have continual exposure to stressful events like abuse or neglect, their alarm system might become overactive. It might be always switched on, as if there was a risk of danger or threat at all times. For a child, this might affect how their brain develops. This is especially the case if it's in the context of stress or trauma events by a primary caregiver. In these cases, the child might develop an understanding of the world as an unsafe and dangerous place, even when they are in a safe situation. Sometimes this is called hypervigilance. It means being on edge or aware of danger at all times. Being exposed to stressful and traumatic events on a regular basis can also have a significant impact on neural connections in the memory center. It can even change the way we remember actual events. People use alcohol and other drugs for a variety of reasons. When someone's experienced trauma, they might be in a constant state of fight or flight, and so might use substances to help move them out of their stress response state. We also know that substance use can affect the way that our brain functions. Chemicals from substances cross the blood-brain barrier and can either stimulate or depress different parts of the central nervous system, affecting how the person feels, thinks, and acts. Similar to cortisol flooding the brain in the stress response, chemicals from alcohol and other drugs can also affect neural pathways and the way the person might make decisions or remember events. Luckily, neural pathways have the lifelong ability to form and change. You might have heard this referred to as neural plasticity. Through developing a better understanding of the brain and the way trauma and alcohol and other drugs affect neural pathways, clients can be better informed and empowered. This is an intervention itself called psychoeducation.
Okay, we can move on to the next slide. Okay, so the takeaways from the video are understanding the way the brain develops and the way stress response impacts the kind of chemistry and neurology in the brain. So understanding that the base of the brain starts to develop first, the brainstem, and then moves kind of around towards the front, the frontal lobe or the prefrontal cortex. As the brain is developing, especially experiencing trauma in childhood while all these components of the brain are developing, impacts the way the architecture is developed over time. All right. So if you take a look at the prefrontal cortex in this diagram here, this diagram comes from the Center on the Developing Child at Harvard University. The prefrontal cortex is the part of the brain that helps people set and achieve goals. It's kind of the seat of your higher mental functioning. All right. When a person experiences trauma, the ability to utilize that part of the brain is diminished. It's significantly diminished. The amygdala and the hippocampus, as mentioned in the video, are part of the limbic system. The limbic system is kind of the part of the brain that doesn't do all that fancy complex thinking. It's more, you could think of it as more of your instinctual response, all right? The amygdala, you actually have two amygdala. There's one for each side of the brain, one for each hemisphere of the brain, but they work together. The amygdala is kind of where the emotions and survival instinct kind of come together. So when the amygdala is constantly firing off or constantly overacting, it can settle into a state of overactivity and constantly be releasing cortisol, which is a chemical related to a stress response. So if you're experiencing a lot of stress, it can just cause your amygdala to kind of constantly be pumping these stressful chemicals into a person's system, right? Even if they are not immediately in a stressful or dangerous situation, all right? The hippocampus it works together with the amygdala. This is a part of the brain that's associated with memory. It kind of helps your brain associate a memory of a traumatic event with that response. So your hippocampus is kind of the part of your brain that gets triggered, so to speak, when at a later point you see or hear or experience something that takes you back to a previous traumatic experience. Okay. So your limbic system is not a part of the brain that can be kind of consciously controlled. It's related a lot to your unconscious survival instincts. All right. Experiencing trauma impacts the way that part of the brain continues to operate. It's not something that you can kind of consciously turn off. All right. Take a look at the next slide, please. So one of the results of experiencing chronic stress and complex trauma is just a slower rate of development of the frontal lobe, as I mentioned before, and the development of neural connections across brain hemispheres. The limbic system is kind of in the center of those two hemispheres. But what research has found is that when children experience a lot of trauma, the connections between both hemispheres of the brain are reduced. So let's take a look at some images, please. Okay. This image comes from a study that was done in the early 2000s. These are actually um, computer generated images of the neurons of young rats. And what this shows is on the left hand side, you see kind of the normal connectivity between neurons in the brain. What you see on the right is the same area of the brain in experimental subject that's experienced high degrees of stress. What I really want you to take away from this image here is the fact that very high levels of stress, which we can understand as experiences of trauma, decreases the ability of neurons to connect. All right. There's still some connections being made, but it slows down that process. The reason why it's so important for you to have many different neural connections is it kind of provides nuance. Having fewer pathways or having fewer neural pathways effectively reduces that neuroplasticity response that was mentioned in the video. Okay, let's take a look at another image, please. Okay, this image here is it comes from the work of a psychologist named Dr. Daniel Amen. He works with medical imaging, and throughout his career has produced tens of thousands of brain scans in his research to see, how brains develop. These are some of his findings. So on the left-hand side, you can see an image of a healthy child's brain. You can see the frontal lobe is kind of at the top of the diagram there, and you can see the two hemispheres of the brain, and the bottom is sort of at the back. In the healthy child, you can see the reddish and yellow areas. The reddish areas represent the areas of most activity, most brain activity. And kind of the darker areas, kind of green going into black, represents less active areas. So you can see in the healthy brain, there's more activity. You can see more areas. You can also see there's more kind of red areas in the center of the brain. If you take a look at the image on the right, that particular brain scan comes from a child from Romania who experienced living in an orphanage for most of their early life. And you can see a distinct difference between the image on the left and the image on the right. There's less activity in the frontal lobe and the prefrontal cortex. There's less activity on both hemispheres of the brain, and there's less activity in the center. One way you can interpret this is there's less activity connecting the activity of the two sides of the brain. So the left side of the brain is where kind of the seat of your logical, ordered thinking resides. The right side of the brain is where the abstract, nonverbal, kind of creative thinking happens. And these two sides of the brain have to function together if they're going to function normally. So you can see in the image on the right, there's less activity. Okay, let's move on. Okay, I want to touch briefly on adverse childhood experiences. There's a great deal of overlap between the concept of trauma and the concept of adverse childhood experiences. I would say they're kind of nested. Adverse childhood experiences can all can all be interpreted or experienced as traumatic, but not necessarily. So the concept of adverse childhood experiences comes out of a study conducted by the Centers for Disease Control in partnership with Kaiser Permanente. They did a study of tens of thousands of people in the San Diego area to try to understand the link between experiences and development. One of the outcomes of the study was the identification of 10 different ACEs, or adverse childhood experiences. They kind of fall under 3 categories. Under the category of abuse, you have physical abuse, there is emotional abuse, and then sexual abuse. In the category of neglect, there's physical neglect, so not having one's physical needs met, and then emotional neglect. So perhaps having those basic material needs met, but not connecting with a caregiver or feeling that emotional support. And then finally, the third category is household dysfunction. So experiences of a household member dealing with mental illness, having a member of the family being incarcerated, maybe a member of the family experiencing substance abuse, experiencing divorce, and then experiencing perhaps domestic violence, or a caregiver or parent treated violently. So these are the 10 general adverse childhood experiences identified by the study. Of course, it's not exhaustive. There are other experiences that a person can go through that you could consider an adverse experience. So research shows that as the number of ACEs rises, risk factors for negative life outcomes increase, which makes children more susceptible to negative mental, behavioral, and physical health problems later in life. Some of those risk factors include higher risk of opioid abuse, higher risk of experiencing depression, higher risk of substance abuse, higher risk of suicidal ideation, higher risk of criminal activity. The higher an ACE score is, the lower the likelihood for an individual's success in school and the workplace later in life. These are very strong indicators of later outcomes in life, which is why they're very important to consider as we're looking at experiences of trauma. Let's take a look at the next image, please. So here is a diagram from the Mayo Clinic indicating the correlation between ACEs score and increased risk of adversity. So you can see that as the ACE score increases, if you look at the x-axis there, as it kind of goes to the right, as the ACE score increases, you can see very clearly that the increased risk of non-completion of high school, unemployment, and household poverty status, it's much higher. Okay? So all of these concepts come together to illustrate a picture of the way in which trauma not only changes the way a person's brain functions, but as a result, changes the way a person behaves in life, their ability to make connections with other people, their ability to achieve or experience success at later points in life. Okay. So now we can take a look at the impact of all of these things in the learning environment in particular. So some of the things that a person might observe in a child in a learning setting or program setting or something like that could involve re-experiencing that event. So there could be something in the learning environment that causes the child to re-experience that traumatic event. A person could demonstrate avoidance. So avoiding circumstances or avoiding people or other factors that could potentially trigger a re-experience of that traumatic event or one of those traumatic events the person has experienced. Negative cognitions and mood. So perhaps blaming others or blaming themselves, not really finding enjoyment in activities, memory loss or inability to remember details. One of the impacts of trauma related to the hippocampus is short-term and long-term memory. So an experience of trauma can impact a person's ability to remember, whether to remember events that have just happened, 15 minutes ago, or events that happened a year ago or a year or two ago. And then finally, arousal. So someone may demonstrate this symptom of being on edge, feeling that hypervigilance, as was mentioned in the video earlier, constantly being on the lookout for danger, constantly worrying. Okay? Symptoms from trauma can directly impact a student's ability to learn. All right? They may seem distracted, or they may be acting out, or maybe demonstrating symptoms that are disruptive or makes it difficult for them to focus or stay on task. Okay, so it's important to be aware of these things because you may initially interpret a child's behavior or the things that they're saying as being mischievous or causing trouble or things of that nature. But what they really could be experiencing is symptoms related to traumatic experiences. All right, and it's helpful in a learning environment, it's helpful in a program environment to be aware of these kinds of factors, especially if you have an understanding or knowledge of the child's history, where they're coming from, and what they've experienced. This is why relationship building with kids is so important, so that you can understand what they've been through, where they're coming from, and how they could be responding to the things that they've experienced in their lives.
Okay, thanks, Erica. That was great. So we are going to shift over to talking about homelessness. As you saw in the first half of the presentation, some of the things that students experience when they experience homelessness are directly related to the ACEs study, for example. So not having your physical needs met, not having safety and things of that nature. But before we get into that, I want to take some time to talk about how we define homelessness, because there is a difference in the way in which the Department of Education defines homelessness compared to how the Department of Housing and Urban Development defines homelessness. And so the McKinney-Vento Act is an act that provides all of these rights to folks experiencing homelessness. We specifically focus on the education piece of the McKinney-Vento Act. And in that act, it defines homelessness as someone who lacks a fixed, so like on the ground, so like not living in a tent, for example, somewhere that is stable, regular, so somewhere that families can have confidence that they're able to return to, and adequate nighttime residence. So adequate as in like the toilet works, the heat works, if that's something you need, the water works. And so this also includes families who are living doubled up, or otherwise known as couch surfing. And this is actually a really big portion of folks experiencing homelessness. And so the University of Chicago did a study in 2018 in conjunction with CPS to study what percent of families experiencing homelessness are living doubled up? And they found that 80% of families in Chicago that were experiencing homelessness were living doubled up. And so why does this matter? So the Department of Housing and Urban Development, which is the department that largely oversees affordable housing and ways to help folks get out of being unstably housed, does not actually recognize folks living doubled up to be experiencing homelessness. And so you can imagine how this impacts the way that we allocate funding, for example, when we think about how do we support folks who are experiencing homelessness. And so I also just want to draw attention to the graphic that shows that most minority groups make up a large share of the homeless population, a larger share of the homeless population than they do of the general population. And so this speaks to the ways in which people of color, specifically Black folks, disproportionately represent the population of people who experience homelessness. And so this is a little bit outside of the scope of this presentation. We could do a whole nother training on the why behind this. But the short story is policy, right? So policies such as redlining or policies that have also inhibited Black folks from gaining stable housing has really contributed to the reason that we see so many folks of color experiencing homelessness. Specifically within CPS, 98% of CPS students experiencing homelessness are students of color. And so that's a really big percentage and speaks to a much larger systemic issue that I would love to get into more. We don't have time, but we will definitely post a training on that. And if you go to the Chicago Hopes for Kids social media and our website, we also have some information on like how redlining relates to that and things of that nature. So we can head over to the next slide. So in this slide is where we're going to link the trauma of homelessness. So homelessness usually results from extreme poverty, right? So not having a safety net, for example, I think we've all seen amidst COVID how easy it can be for someone to lose their job and quickly become homeless if you aren't able to have that safety net. There's also a lack of affordable housing, right? Especially in cities like Chicago. The waitlist for HUD can be up to 10 years. It's a really long time to be waiting on affordable housing. And what do you do in those 10 years, right? And then fractured social support. So it makes a lot of sense, right, that we see a lot of families who are experiencing homelessness living doubled up because that is the way that we come together as community and support each other. But unfortunately, not everyone is able to do that. And the next thing I want to get to is also the relationship between loss and homelessness. So when someone experiences homelessness, they don't just experience the loss of their house, right? It might be the loss of community. So if you are living in Rogers Park and you are now uprooted to South Chicago, that's a really far way. And so you might no longer have those community resources. Also experiencing a loss of stability and routines. So for example, some of the students we work with might have increased commutes to school. And so that kind of shakes up their routine. Not knowing where you're spending the night, right? That also contributes to instability. In addition, I would add like a loss of privacy, right? So not having your own space, your own place to keep your things safe. Security, so being in an unfamiliar environment, being exposed to other folks, maybe being in a large space and not having that sense of privacy or security, and then potential separation. So in our country and largely in Chicago, there are a lot of shelters that are specifically for women and children. And so this presents a problem for families where there is the presence of a male figure and maybe that male figure does not fit into what the shelter allows. And so now there's family separation. Divorce can also be a cause of homelessness, right? So losing one income could move a family into experiencing poverty and experiencing homelessness. And so that is something else that comes along with experiencing homelessness. And then family connections. So for example, a lot of affordable housing in Illinois right now is in Rockford and Waukegan. If your whole family is in Chicago and you're now uprooted to Waukegan, how do you get to your family? And then just an overall increased uncertainty, right? So not knowing, maybe what school you're going to go to next year, or what school you're going to go to tomorrow. And so what we also find is that students who experience homelessness are also more likely to experience a variety of things, such as getting sick. Especially now with COVID, that has been something that we've seen that has been pretty impactful, right? So the risk of someone in a building of 70 people getting COVID, that is really high, right? Spreads very easily. People are living very close to each other. When someone gets a cold, it's really easy for other folks to get colds. And so that definitely plays a role in a student's, ability to go to school and focus, right? No one likes to do things when they're sick. And so that can be really challenging. Also repeating a grade or falling behind. So each time a student transfers schools, they are at risk for falling behind about 3 months in their education. And so, similarly to anyone who started a new job, right? Like you get in a new place, you're trying to figure out the culture, what's going on. We know each school does not teach the same thing. And so maybe a student is presented with material they've never seen before. Maybe they're presented with material that they've saw last year, actually. And so they're bored and ready for the next step. And so that can really contribute to a student's ability to be successful academically. Students who experience homelessness are at an increased risk for experiencing anxiety and depression. So 50% of students who experience homelessness were found to experience anxiety and depression compared to 18% of their housed peers. And there's also an increased risk of experiencing PTSD. And so there's a lot of research that shows that students who experience any kind of trauma, and homelessness could be one of those, have an increased risk for experiencing PTSD. And typically we focused a lot on soldiers and military folks when we study PTSD. And there is a growing body of literature showing that students who have had, or anyone who has had an adverse childhood experience, is at risk for experiencing PTSD. All right, you can go to the next slide. I also want to highlight that the relationship between homelessness and education is bidirectional, right? So if a student comes to experience homelessness and starts to fall behind academically, they are then at an increased risk for experiencing homelessness in adulthood. So there's that cyclical relationship, right? Of if you're starting to experience homelessness, it impacts your education, and then that impacts your housing outcome in adulthood. And so what I really like about this graphic, this was done in a study at the University of Chicago's Chapin Hall, where they looked at young adults who were experiencing homelessness. And they found that young adults who experience homelessness were less than a third as likely to be enrolled in four-year college as their stably housed peers. So Erica kind of touched on this already. Really just want to reiterate what you might observe. Let's say if you're in a classroom setting or a setting where you're working with not only youth, but really anyone. What are some of the behaviors you may observe that should trigger a thought of like, okay, maybe this person is experiencing something else. So again, worrying about safety of self and others. So this can show up as like students who are very clingy, who maybe don't want you to leave, increased distress. So maybe unusually whiny, irritable, moody. I think especially for teachers who are used to working with students every day, can definitely notice if a student who's typically pretty outgoing and happy starts to come into the classroom and seems to be a little bit moody, a little bit more irritable, that is an indication that something might be going on. Decreased attention in our concentration, angry outbursts in our aggression. So something that we see with students who are experiencing homelessness in our program is, for example, if a student drops a snack, right? They might have an outburst that to someone who doesn't understand that that student might be experiencing food insecurity or what that snack might mean for them, on the surface, it might seem like a unwarranted outburst, right? But to that student, that food might mean something so much more different than it means for someone who's not experiencing food insecurity. Absenteeism is a really big indicator, distrust of others. I would also add like not wanting to build relationships, especially for students who have had experiences where they've built close relationships and then they have to move, or that person then exits their life. And so maybe a hesitancy to want to get close to people. And also increased somatic complaints. So especially with young children, they might not have the language to say, I'm experiencing anxiety. And so it might come about in the form of, I have a stomach ache, or my head hurts, my chest hurts. And so that could also be an indicator of like, you've been coming with a stomach ache pretty often. What's going on? And then difficulty with authority, redirection, or criticism. And I think this largely speaks to power, right? When someone is experiencing homelessness, there is a decrease in the sense of agency that they have, and a loss of power. And so that can manifest, especially in a school setting, with authority, right? And so I also want to draw attention to the graphic that shows, which this is, I wish we had more time to go into this, but it shows that there is a correlation between suspensions and expulsions and low socioeconomic status. So this study showed that they found that students who come from low socioeconomic status backgrounds were found to be suspended and expelled more than their more affluent peers. And so this just highlights some of the ways that some of these behaviors may be misinterpreted as mischievous, or the ways in which, let's say, like folks who are working with students might not be able to take the time to really dive into what is going on with this student. And so it could result in expulsion and a whole other myriad of things that we don't have time to get into, which I would love to do another training on. But we will head to the next slide, as I do want to leave some time for questions. So the last thing, okay, best practices. So let's talk about like, what can we do? So the goal is not to look at this from a deficit perspective, right? It is to understand the ways in which trauma might impact a student and then respond in ways that really set students up for success and really promote what is called like post-traumatic growth that can help to change some of those neural pathways in the brain. And so that's one of the best things about the brain, right? Is it has the ability to be changed. And a lot of that change happens through action. And so how can we set students up for success in a way that helps to build their social emotional skills, build their ability to engage in relationships. And so that's actually the first one, is to really build connected relationships with students. As Erica mentioned, building relationships is really important, not only for the purpose of knowing a child's history and what is going on, but also for providing that student with the opportunity to build a really positive relationship with someone. Set clear boundaries and expectations, and then support students into success. So the goal is not to say, we don't hold expectations for you and we don't have boundaries because we understand that you're experiencing trauma, because that's not healthy either, right? Providing structure and really clear expectations can provide an opportunity for a student to meet those expectations. And so I'll go into the graphic in a second, because it shows some of the things that we do in our program that help students do that. Aim for restorative practices rather than punitive ones, right? So the goal is not to take away a student's toy and then that's it, right? Talk to the student about, hey, this is why this behavior is distracting, or it goes against our values. And this is why we have our values. And this is, most importantly, this is what you can do to restore this. And so you can address like harm done, for example, and talk to the student about maybe how to talk to classmates or anyone related to the harm that has been done in the room. Create predictability when possible. So something as easy as having a schedule can help students who are experiencing a lot of instability have some of that structure and predictability and know, okay, at 2:15, we are going to do this. And I can tell you that if you have a schedule, students will keep you to it. We have a lot of students who are like, no, it's 2:30 and we're supposed to be doing circle time and sharing how we're feeling. And so that also gives the student the opportunity to take on a position of leadership, right? Like you can assign a student to be the timekeeper for the day, for example. Honor the students' emotions and need for space while also getting their systems to calm in a safe way. And so in our program, we use a chill zone. So a really clear designated space that students can go to if they need to take a break before they're ready to talk about what might have happened. And then finally, take care of yourself. Anyone who is working in an environment where there is trauma is susceptible to what we call vicarious trauma or secondhand trauma. And so it's really important to check in with yourself for signs of burnout. So for example, if you notice you are starting to get really agitated and irritable in settings where you normally wouldn't have, that can be a sign of burnout. Making sure that you have supports in place in your life. So if that means talking to your coworkers or talking to a therapist, or really just making sure you have an outlet to also process what you may be experiencing by watching someone experience what can be a very difficult time in their life. And so really quickly, just want to draw attention to our Bitmoji classroom. I think this has been one of like the highlights that has come out of COVID for our organization, is we have found really creative ways to integrate virtual learning. And so this is really similar actually to what our program room looks like. And so you can see we have a daily schedule for students. So they know, okay, this is when we're going to do group circle. This is when we're doing literacy. We have our values clearly stated. Respect ourselves, respect others, and respect the space. And this is really about safety, right? So it's not about compliance. It's about creating a community in our program where students are very clear on what our values are and how to do that. We also use Katya cards. So we don't have actually like a chart that we use where students can monitor how they're doing, and they can be given opportunities to become leaders. But basically, when students get to the leader point at the end of program, they get a Katya card. And once the whole chart is full, the entire classroom gets like a pizza party or some kind of prize. And so this is a way to build like a collective way, of promoting positive engagement, right? So respecting the space doesn't just matter for you, it matters for everyone. And so if we are all demonstrating leadership, we all get something. We have some affirmations that our staff go over with our students, and then our chill zone and our activities. So just wanted to highlight that as an example. And with that, we have about 5 minutes left. I apologize, we initially wanted to leave more time for questions, but we would like to open it up. Feel free to drop your questions in the chat. Feel free to unmute yourself, and we are happy to answer any questions that you might have. I also want to draw attention to our feedback survey. So if you take out your phone and just open up your camera app and hover over the image, it should pull up a Google form. And so we would love to hear from you all, what you thought of this training, and also what you might be interested in the future.